Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to this web development webinar. I am Ananya Ganesh and I'll be taking this webinar on Introduction to Web Development. I've been working with web development for over 2 years now, and I'm here today to share some of what I've learned. So this is what we're going to discuss in this webinar. We're going to start off with some HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and we'll also look into editors like Visual Studio Code and my preferences on editors, extensions, and also start working with Chrome developer tools. So first, let's talk about IDEs and extensions, and my personal favorite is the Visual Studio Code IDE. And let's just pop on to Visual Studio Code this minute. And here we go. If you look into Visual Studio Code, this is how it looks like. This is where you can navigate between files. And let's talk about our extensions here. The few extensions that I like to highlight is one called Beautify. So Beautify is used to format your code. So it's really helpful, especially if you're working with long lines of code, and it makes your code cleaner to look, and you can use keyboard shortcuts to run Beautify. And another Visual Studio Code extension I'd like to talk about is Git Lens. So this is really helpful, especially if you're working in a community and you're linking your code to GitHub. It's helpful so you can easily identify who committed the code and when and what the commit message was. So it's easy to track who changed up what part of your code. Another Visual Studio Code extension is something called Remote WSL. So what Remote WSL is, it enables you to access Visual Studio Code from any command line. So you could use your terminal, and if you just have this enabled, you can go into the folder and just type in code space period, and this enables your Visual Studio Code to start running just like this. You could also use Spotify for Visual Studio Code. So if you're coding and you want to listen to music on the side, you can have an extension enabled on Visual Studio Code itself. Another thing is Live Server. So this is really helpful for something like this, like a webinar, when I want to make some code and do some changes and make sure it gets reflected on the screen. So you can, and again, this is a simple keyboard shortcut that you can use once you've installed this server, and it allows you to see your live changes on a web page. This is how you do it. Another thing that people like, or developers like doing, is to add themes to their page. So this is a Cobalt theme, which makes your code, Visual Studio Code, dark blue. And there are many themes that you can choose from. I personally just prefer using the basic theme, but you can customize your Visual Studio Code to look as good and however you'd like it to look. So that's it for now. In this, you could also search, and you can search something and you can replace all occurrences of that. That's really cool. This is for the file structure. And yep, let's get back to the slides. So now let's talk about what HTML is. So HTML is hypertext markup language, and what that is it adds structure to a web page. So it forms the skeleton of what your web page would look like. There are a lot of HTML tags, but few important ones are these. This is the header tag. So you have header tags from H1 to H6, each varying with sizes, H1 being the biggest and H6 being the one with the least font size. Then you have paragraph tags, so you can enclose your paragraphs, descriptions between these tags. Hyperlink tags for linking them, tables. And an important thing to note is all HTML tags have an opening tag and a closing tag. So the closing tag will have a forward slash. So you could do this h1 and then you could have a forward slash for closing the h1 tag. So almost all HTML tags need to be closed using a closing tag, but there are some tags called self-closing tags. So some examples are BR tag, that's a break tag, the HR tag, which is horizontal line, image, input, and link. So these are examples of some web pages where you can see it's just simple HTML. So if we just look into this picture here, this is a header tag, this is an unordered list, and there are multiple header tags and paragraph tags here. If you look into this picture, this has an image tag inserted here, it has a link tag over here, and it also has a horizontal line. So with HTML, apart from just these basic tags, you can also add structure to your web page. So you could add a layout like this. So this would be a header, and this would be a nav, a section, a side, and footer. So the header tag is something that would stick to the top and defines the header for the document. The nav defines the navigation links, so you could have like a nav bar out here. You can add a section of the document. So and what aside does, it sets aside this part of the document. You could also add tables and images in the tables. So all this is just adding layouts to the HTML. So let's just look at this picture for a second. This is what I plan to recreate in this demo. And so if you look closely, you can see that there's this nav tag area where we have two images, and we also have a couple of cards with the list of courses. So if you're following along to this code along, feel free to do so. You could add your hobbies in place of courses out here. You could grab images from the internet, and you can be creative. So let's just switch to the code here. Alright, before I head into that, let's just look at this demo that I'd like to give you. So like I said, you can open with live server here. And once you do so, you could see your code running right here. So this is an example of a web page that has used all the HTML tags, mostly all of them, but there's no styling added to it. So this is a header tag, this is a marquee, these are paragraph tags, this is an image tag, there's a link right here, these are the topics, and this is an unordered list. This is a table right here. Let's go back to the code and try to understand what we've done here. So as you can see, this is a heading tag. Make sure that these heading tags are closed. This is a marquee paragraph tag. And so this is an unordered list. If you want to make it an ordered list, you just have to type OL. In the table tag right here, you can see this is a table row. TH stands for table heading. So that comes as the title of your table. And TD is table data. So you can insert multiple rows with TD for table data and TR for table row. Another thing that you could look into this is the HTML is segregated into head and body. So body is where all your content for the web page goes in, and in the head we add a title tag. So what a title tag is what shows up on top of when you open a new page, on the tab. And meta tags are useful for configuring. So this meta tag right here is for configuring the web page to also look good on mobile phones. So it sets the viewport and content to device width and initial scale 1, so that your web page is equally scaled even on the mobile view. So let's just create a folder called index.html, and start coding for the web page that we would like to build. So you could use this snippets that allow you to, that give you shortcuts to some part of the code, and then you can just fill in. So let's set the title as webinar. And right here in the body, we'd like to segregate it between a header. So let's just say header, and in the header we add a div tag, and in the div tag we'll have one image tag for the DSC logo. So another cool thing about VS Code is, especially when you're adding links and all that to your tags, you need to specify the correct file name, because that could throw you errors. So you could go to image tag and then go to DSC logo, and then let's add the other image tag for the GitHub logo, and that's what the header consists of. If we go down, let's just have a div and another div so this div is for the courses, list of courses. So this is the courses container, and this is for one specific card, right? So you have multiple cards, and this is for one of them. And in that, I'll also like to segregate it from card image, where we'd add the image of the card. So right here you can add in any image that you like. You could add in, if you're following along and doing for some hobby, you could add in that image, and close the tag. And then we'd add in card information. So right here you could add, say, a paragraph tag saying title of the course. This could also be an H6 tag or an H4 tag, depending on how you'd like it to be. Let's also add a button and call this more information. And this is a simple structure of how we'd like our website to look. Let's just open this with Live Server and take a closer look. And right here we can see that we've added two images, and this is the course image and this is the title of the course and more information. Of course, this is just the basic structure of the web page, and it has no CSS added to it yet. And if you're not sure what CSS is, let's just go back to the slides. And let's get to it. So what is CSS? So we just saw that we built a web page that just had the structure, like the backbone of what we wanted our web page to look like, but it didn't look anything like the picture. So to make it look presentable and to add visual appeal to a web page, we use something called CSS. And CSS is cascading style sheets. So you could add styling to your web page. So there are some CSS rules that we must follow, and that is how you can set CSS. So like we saw about the div tag, the body tag, the paragraph tag. So if you want to add styles to these tags, you'd mention it like P, which represents the paragraph tag, color red. So color is the attribute and red is the value. And this is a similar output of what you'd get if you wrote something like this, where of course hello world is enclosed in paragraph tags. So similarly, if the paragraph had a class and this were the class name, then you would add CSS to that class name by referencing it with a full stop or a period and say dot class name font size 20 pixels. So this increases the font size to about 20 pixels. Now if you had an ID for the paragraph tag, then you would add it using hashtag demo demo being the name of the ID, and saying font style italic, which would give it hello world in italics. So now, of course, over here, color, font size, and font style are attributes, and red, 20 pixels, and italic are the values to those attributes. So let's get into CSS specificity. We initially spoke about how you could add CSS using the paragraph tag, class name, or ID. So what if I do all of them at once? So if you do all of them at once, then actual CSS that counts on the web page is the one that's more specific. So the ID is more specific than the class, which is more specific than the tag. If you're a little confused now, let's look into the example so it's better understood. So if I say introduction being the ID, see how it's referenced with the hashtag, and if I say color red, it means that I'm setting the color red. And if I say dot message, color green, and if I say paragraph P, color blue. So now your web page is confused if it should be blue, green, or red. But it always considers the ID tag, and then considers the styles for the class, and then considers the styles that are applied to the tag. So this is the order of specificity. There's also something called inline styles, which we'll understand more when we go into the demo. But since we are here talking about specificity, you could also add inline styles to your code, in which case inline styles are given more preference than the ID. Another thing that we should discuss is something called font sizing. So like how we mentioned 20 pixels out there, there are multiple units that you could use in CSS to add styles to add font sizes to your text. So you could use pixels like we used before, or you could use viewport width, viewport height, or you could use EM or REM. So all this is a little too much right now. I'll just explain the basic. So if you use pixels, if your screen is 1600 pixels, then you account for each pixel, and that's how much you assign your div to be. If you use viewport width and viewport height, so if your entire viewport is 1600 pixels, then that will be 100% of the viewport width. And if you're using EM, so it's relative to the parent's font size, and so what happens in this is so if your parent element is 16 pixels, so 1 EM is equal to 16 pixels. So this causes cascading. We get into that. And REM is relational EM, which is similar to EM, but it's relative to the root element. So if your HTML tag has a basic font size of 16 pixels, then 1 REM will be equal to 16 pixels. And since it won't vary with depth like how EM would vary. And yeah, that's about it for font sizing. Let's talk about CSS properties. And one property that's really important is called display. And the three mainly used attributes for display are block, inline, and none. So let's look at this image right here. And if I say this, and this are three elements of this page, then you can see how in case of display block, each element is given the full width of the page irrespective of its individual width. And like you can see, yeah. But in case of inline, each element is given just as much width as it was assigned to itself. So this is useful in case of adding a nav bar. So you want all the nav links to be in the same line. So that's when you use something like inline. And block is used when you want to give each element, irrespective of its own width, the entire web page size. Let's look at something called the CSS property called position. And so position is what enhances how you lay things out on your page. And let's look at these elements 1, 2, and 3 inside this parent element here. So each of these elements are given a position default, static by default. So if an element has been given a position static, it's not specially positioned in any way. To do so, we could use something called relative. So relative position is similar to static, but the only difference is if you add attributes like left, right, bottom, top, that's what differentiates it. So if you look at this dark blue element here, its position is relative and it's shifted left by 20 pixels since it has CSS left 20 pixels. Now let's look at fixed and absolute as well. So it's quite confusing, the two of them, but what fixed is used for is, let's define this again. See, there are three elements, 1, 2 and 3 in a parent container, right? So what fixed does is it positions the element relative to the entire page, but what absolute does is it positions the element relative to the parent container, parent element. So in this case, this dark blue element is given a position absolute and bottom right and right 0. So that means it is 0 pixels from the bottom and 0 pixels from the right. In case the same thing was done with position fixed, then it would be relative to the entire web page and not just to this element. I'd like to also talk about some misunderstandings in CSS, or something that people are still not sure of. So that is the difference between padding and margin. So padding is the distance from the border, the inner distance from the border of an element, like this, and margin is defined as the space, outer space from the border of the element. We can also talk about font sizes here. So 16 pixels, this is 100% 1 EM and 1 REM. So EM, as you remember, is relative to the parent element's font size. So in case I have another div which is 1 EM, it would be relative to the parent element, right? So we can get more into understanding this once we start our demo. For now, let's explore Chrome DevTools. And so if you're looking at this on a laptop, feel free to open a tab and open a website. Yeah, so you can open up any website that you like, and I'm going to open up dscvit.com. Now, if you're on a Mac, you could press Command-Shift-I. If you're on Windows, you can press Control-Shift-I or use a shortcut F12. So what this does is this opens up Chrome DevTools. And Chrome DevTools is huge help for all developers out there because you can do so much with Chrome DevTools. So let's just explore what we can do. So firstly, if your Chrome DevTools looks different on your page, it's because you can position it based on how you like. You could dock it to the bottom, you can dock it to the right, you can dock it to the left, or you can even undock it to a separate window. For now, let's just keep it as it is here. If you open up console, and let's just use inspect element, this arrow right to the bottom, to the top left. And once we do that, we can inspect all the elements on this web page. So you can see this is a nav bar, and these are elements on the nav bar. And if you notice, there's this yellow lining, and that is the margin, and this green part is padding. So we click on any one of them, and you look at the console again, you can see this part of the console where it gives you an overview of each element and its margin, its padding. So you can see this element has 15 pixels padding, it has no border defined, no margin defined. So similarly, if we inspect, say, this menu item here, you can do the same thing where you can see margin is 25 pixels, there's no border assigned, and there's no padding assigned, right? And so this is really cool because you can inspect any element you'd like. So let's just say we inspect this one. And right here you can also add styles, and you could add color, and something really cool is you could add a color picker. So if you don't remember the exact hex code, and if you're not sure what looks right on the web page, you can open up the color picker and just play around with it till you find a color that you think looks best for the website. There you go. And font size, let's just do that. So another thing that Chrome DevTools does is you can do this. It gives you the list of options that are available, and you could just check out, scroll down and see, because CSS is really vast, and a lot of times you learn about new styles and new attributes using Chrome DevTools. So the more you explore and play around with Chrome DevTools, the more you learn. So you can see that there are styles like small, medium, large that are already there with Chrome DevTools, or you could set font size to, let's say, 12 pixels, and you see the difference. So if I say 2em, you can see how much of a difference 12 pixels and 2em is, because em is relative to the parent element. If you keep increasing it, whoa, okay. Another thing you could do is you could get into the code here. So this is the code for this website, and if you right click on this, you could edit as HTML. So what that means is I can now write anything I'd like here. So I could say, welcome to this webinar, and when I click enter, that's what it says. So I mean, it could be really tedious if you have to save and run the code multiple times to see if it's working all right. And this is a quick fix, because using Chrome DevTools, you can not only change the CSS of all its elements and inspect it, but you can also change the text. So you can figure out what works out right for you instead of constantly changing between tabs and trying to run the program again. So let's head back to the slides. Okay, I'm open to questions right now, so if anyone has questions, feel free to put them out. Feel free to add your questions regarding CSS, because I think what we've done so far could be a handful if you're new to it. We've explored Chrome DevTools and done a lot about positions and display and a lot of other attributes. I think if not now, maybe after the demo you could add your questions. So I'm just going to give another 30 seconds if anyone wants to. Alright, I think we have a question asking how to, can you explain, Angad Sharma is asking, can you explain a bit about the performance tab on Chrome DevTools? Sure, so let's just go back to, and also, okay, hierarchy in CSS. So hierarchy in CSS, I've spoken about how the CSS preference order, which is the inline styles will be given highest preference, after which you'll be given preference to the ID, then the class, and then after which you'll get the actual tag preference. So I think we'll understand more about hierarchy in CSS once we actually get into the demo. For now, let's get back to Right, let's get back to this and look at the performance tab. So you can start profiling it, and this is really helpful if you're building a PWA, so you can see how well your PWA is performing. And PWA is basically a programmable progressive web app, and yeah, so this would take a little time, but what it does is it tells you how well your application is working and how you could modify it to make it to make it more accessible. So this could be a little off topic if I start talking about what a PWA is and how this works. So I'll just look for another question. Alright, there is a question by Saurav Pandey on can you show something about Z-index? Sure, we'll look into that when we get into the demo, but a basic understanding of what Z-index is it adds, it's what you can add. So it's like adding layers to a page. So let's just say you have two elements and I want the first element to be on top of the second element. I could add a Z-index of 1, and so when you do that, the element is displayed on top of the previous element. So another thing is if your Z-index isn't working, you could make sure that your Z-index, the element on which you're applying Z-index, has position absolute, right? So that's important. It's just a prerequisite of how Z-index works. A really good example of what Z-index is and an application for it would be modals. So if when you have pop-ups on your page that come up, they come up on your page and the other part of your page is slightly dull, and that's how you implement Z-index. So basically the modal that comes up, you add a really high Z-index for it. So you add a Z-index like probably 500 or something, and so it's really high up on the page. Are there any more questions? Regarding Z-index, another really cool thing that you could do is there's a Chrome extension that you could add to your Chrome DevTools, and that allows you to visualize the layers. So it's really helpful, especially if you're debugging and you don't know why your Z-index isn't showing up. There's a Chrome extension for Z-index, and it gets enabled on your Chrome DevTools, and using that you could visualize every layer, and that's something I learned recently that's really cool. Okay, I think we should get to building our get to building the demo. Alright, before that, you might have always seen how your web page looks really good on desktop, but if you're working, it doesn't look good on your mobile phone. And so it's really important that your website is responsive, and the need of the hour is developers working with mobile first view. That is, they first design for the mobile, since majority of their users are going to be working on their mobile. So if your website looks really good on mobile, it's already doing great. So, and how you do that using CSS is something called media queries. So this is the syntax for a media query. You can add @media only screen and max width 600 pixels. So the important part here is the max width and min width here. So what max width is that if your browser size is anything less than 600 pixels, then it'll set the background color to light blue. And min width is if your browser width is equal to or greater than 600 pixels, then it sets your background color to light green. So obviously this is a very, very basic example of how media queries work, and there's a lot you can do with media queries, right from changing the layout altogether, displaying some parts of your web page and hiding some parts of your web page. So there's a lot. You can get creative with media queries, and it's something that's really key in making your web page look responsive and beautiful. Yep, so as I was talking about the power of CSS, there's a lot you can do with CSS, right, from responsive design to animations to building shapes. But for now, let's look at CSS Grid. So CSS Grid enables you to add all your contents in a grid and align them equally, and there are a lot of properties that you can use to CSS Grid. So you could add columns and different contents. So we get into more about CSS Grid in the demo, and I'll be starting the demo just shortly. But before that, I'd like to talk about CSS frameworks. So you've heard a lot so far what we've done for CSS. We've spoken so much about its properties and how it's really important to get it responsive, and all this might be really overwhelming at first. So frameworks make all of this much easier. So you could use something like Bootstrap or Material UI or Semantic UI, and all of these are frameworks for CSS, and they obviously do make the job easier, but it's really important to know what CSS is. And I mean, so in my personal opinion, I feel frameworks make the job much easier, but unless you're well versed with the basics of CSS, it could be really hard to understand how those frameworks work. And that's just my preference. Let's just get to the demo. Alright, so if you remember, this is the page that we built with an image and multiple images here. So let's just add a class and say logo, and give this a class, let's say GitHub, right? And oh, before I forget, so I made a folder out here called CSS. You could add a file called styles.css. Out there, I misspelled it. Cool. Doesn't matter, but it kind of irritates me. Okay, there. And so in this page, you can add your styles. Before I forget, we need to remember to link our CSS. So we link our CSS in the head tag using a link. Link rel equals style sheet, and we give it an href. So then again, here you need to go into the CSS folder and link styles.css. Alright, close the tag. And so now we've defined classes for these. So let's just go back here and say .logo. Since it was a class, this is the class name, we reference it using .logo. And since it's an image, we need to add some properties for width and its height. So one neat trick that I like using is setting one of the properties, either height or width, to auto. And what that allows me to do is it helps in the responsive view of the image. And let's just add some padding, let's say 20 pixels. Now let's go to GitHub. Something similar here, width auto, and height 12 VH. Here I'm using viewport width and viewport height, and 20 pixels. Also, you would have noticed that the logo was to the left, so we could do that using float left, and we could add the GitHub logo to the right using float right. Alright, so let's just go back and give this a class course container, and call it using .course container. And so here I'll be giving it a display property, and if you look into this, there's a lot of display properties. The 3 ones that I spoke about were just the basic and the most commonly used ones. Another thing is grid. So since for this demo we'll be using CSS Grid, you'll need to add display grid to your property. And there's something called grid template columns. And so for now we just made one card. Let's just copy this and paste it 3 more times, so we have 4 cards on the page. Right. Format it using the formatter. That's right. And okay, getting back to grid. So what grid template columns does is that there are going to be 4 boxes, and each of the 4 boxes occupy now 25% width of the entire container. So FR is a new unit that we're studying here that gives each of the elements in the course container equal width, that is 25%, 25%, 25%. So a fourth of the entire width of the course container. So now let's just add grid gap. You can also add separate gap for the columns and rows. So what grid gap does is it adds the same spacing on the on both sides, the column and the row. So now let's head back and start styling the card. Let's give this a class card. And you could use ID as well, but it's just a personal preference. So if you use class can be applied to multiple items, but ID is specific to only one item. So IDs are usually unique, and a card is something that we have multiple times on the page, so you could add it as a class name instead. So let's just say class, and we could give this probably a style, like we could give it a border. So let's just go ahead and give it a border of 1 pixel, solid black. So in Visual Studio Code, the other thing is that you can add colors, or you could add the RGB value, or you could tinker in here and figure out which color works out best for you. That's also really cool. And 1 pixel is just the width, and this solid mentioned out here could be dashed or dotted, and that would define how the border would look. So now let's just go back here, save this, and just run it, open it with live server and see if it works. There you go. One second. So there we go. This is our page after it's been styled. You can see that there's a border to these images and to these cards. Oh, we forgot, we could style these images and we could add margin to this container. So instead of going back into the code, what we could do is just open up Chrome DevTools right here, inspect this element, and say let's add, this is the image, so let's just add a width of auto, a height of 20, viewport width. There you go, it's already starting to look better. And let's just look at this, the card information. We could add font size 20 pixels. We could add something called font weight, which is 500 pixels, 500, or let's increase it up so you understand what font weight does. Font weight makes it bolder. So if I add 900, so you can see the difference out here. Alright, Now let's just grab this container, the course container, and give it some margin top. So margin top is the margin from the top. Let's just say 100 pixels. You can see that's reducing, and there's some margin at the top. So now once we understand what we want to do, we can go back into the code and start working that part out. All right. Alright, so let's just go back to the code. And you can see that we've added code for the course image. And let's just test if it works out. So what we've added is something called card, and that we already labeled out here in index.html. Let's just call this class, give it a class and say course image, and do the same for all of them. Right, let's save it. And check out the demo. So now that you can see, we've also added some border and some box shadow to the cards, and CSS is something that you can customize to make it look good as much as you like, and you can just work around a lot with it. So in this case, if I look into this box, this card, and say add some padding to the card, say 20 pixels, you can see that this is padding, right? Similarly, if I add margin to the card, 20 pixels, you can see this is margin. Do you see the difference between margin and padding? This is the margin. So margin acts on the outer space of the border, while padding acted on the inner space of the border. So now that we have this ready, we could do something called, if you type on toggle device toolbar, you can see how your web page would look on different phone screens. And right now this is not responsive, it doesn't look good. So let's just go back to the code and add some media queries, right? So there are multiple phones that you could use. You can add a responsive view as well, where you could resize it to any width that you like and figure out. So here, right here, the width is mentioned, so you can tell at 829 or like at 900, I'd rather have, at this width I'd rather have 3, right, 3 of those cards. So let's just go back to the code and do the same. Oops. Yeah, let's just go back to the code here. And here I've added some code for the media queries. So here min width, which as I defined earlier is any width greater than 760 pixels, it'll become 1FR, 1FR. So this basically means that each of the containers will now have 1/3 of the grid width. And if it's 949 pixels or more, they'll be given 25% of the grid width. Let's add one more. And here, so this one adds defines the min width and the max width. So any width greater than 472 pixels and any width less than 767 pixels, the grid column template would have 50%. So each of the cards would have 50% of the grid width. So let's just save this. And head back to the demo where we could see how this works out. So there we see that at 847, which is less than 949, we only have 3 of the cards. And as we go lower, now we have 50%. So each of the cards occupies 50% of the grid width. Another thing that you could inspect here is that if you notice, the padding out here is almost leaking into this container. So we could reduce the padding, right? So the cards look more centered. We could do the same on this side. So CSS and getting things to work and look the way you like is really time consuming, but it's really gratifying at the end. Let's add something real quick. Let's give this a class and say card info, or let's just call it info. And so basically what we're doing is trying to gather all the information of the card in one screen. And so what that does is, if you notice, I've added a class here and I've given it a padding of 20 pixels. So if you look at it in comparison to the other cards, it looks more centered and neater. Of course, you could go ahead and start styling the title, the button, but I think for now this is it. This is responsive, and we understood how grids work, and majorly the difference between margin and padding and how to use Chrome DevTools. Let's head back over to the slides. Right, so I'll just take another questions break because we did do quite a lot in the demo. Okay, so Gurnemat asks, how do we select our media query breakpoints? So there are some resources that allow you to that have set breakpoints for specific phone devices, and there is a GitHub link where you can actually just you could see, okay, so if I'm using a Galaxy phone, that this is the width point I'd set. And so based on the phones, if you're doing phone first styling, you could Google something and then you could get the actual values for the breakpoints. But if you're just exploring, then, and if you're just building your own site, it's really important to know how you set breakpoints. So if you just look at this, all right, the screen out here is at 663, and we know that this looks good for it. So as we increase it a little bit more at 831, so this is the value of the width, sorry, this is the value of the height, and this is the value of the width, and based on this value you could set your breakpoints. So in the code, when I mention max width and min width, it's by looking at these values that I do that. So to give you a gist of what you just asked me, if you're looking to make something with which is very specific to mobile phones, you could always Google the exact values for the breakpoints. But otherwise, you could just, and if you're just building something for yourself, you could go into the open up Chrome DevTools and start checking out the responsive view, and you could set breakpoints to customize the page however you like. Okay, Prasanna asks, will you please do a tutorial on how to use Visual Studio Code? Yes, we could do that, but not right now. I'll convey that to my team and let's see if we can do something about it. For now, let's just get back to the slides. And okay, so far we understood what HTML is, what JavaScript does, what CSS does, sorry. And let's head into the third element and the most important element of how you make a web page interactive. So JavaScript is a scripting language and it enables you to add functionality to your web page. So far, the web page we built just has a few cards, images, and it looks good. We made it look good on the phone and on different sizes of the browser, but it has no functionality yet. So what I mean by functionality, let's just look into it. So we could go back into our code. Alright, and right here we could add a file called, inside the JavaScript folder, you could add a file called app.js. You could name it however you like. And this file structure I personally prefer, where I have CSS in one folder, all the images in one folder, and my JavaScript separate. So in the JavaScript folder, let's just alert something to see if it's working. Let's just say, how's it going? Right, save this and always remember to link your files. So we link our JavaScript files right above the body tag in a script tag. And in the source, we'll mention its destination, which is in the JS folder and called app.js. So a reason why we link our JavaScript files below everything in the code is so that all your content starts loading first and your JavaScript's loaded on top of it. So let's just go back to the demo. And hey, there we see an alert that says, how's it going? So that means that okay, cool. So that means that we've linked our JavaScript file. Let's head back to the slides and see what's more. Alright, so before we head into starting our code in JavaScript, let's talk about the basics. And like any programming language, we have variables, keywords, reserved keywords, and functions in JavaScript. So variables is how you define your variables, and you could use keywords like let, const, or var to define your variables. And keywords are basically something like if, for, while. Reserved keywords are like for data types boolean, integer, string, class. And we learn more about functions and their syntax as we demo. Okay, this is something that's really important in JavaScript and what makes it really, really powerful. So that's called DOM manipulation. And DOM manipulation is document object model. So let's just look at this tree right here. And this is a document. The root element was an HTML element. And it was segregated into a head tag and a body tag, if you remember. So in the head tag, I added a title, and the title had a text. So for our HTML, we made it webinar, right? And in the body, we add elements, 2 elements, an hyperlink and a h1, that's a header. And the h1 had a text, my header, and this has text and an attribute. So this is how you can visualize your code. So all of these are called nodes, and this heading has 2 child nodes, right? So the root element has 2 child nodes, the body tag and the head tag. The body tag has 2 child nodes or 2 child elements, which is the anchor tag and the heading tag. So these child tags have a parent tag. So this is some terminology that you must get used to, and you can read up more about if you're really interested in. But yeah, this is something that's really important, and DOM manipulation and is something that's really important in JavaScript. So let's go on. Yeah, another really important thing is event listeners in JavaScript. So the core functionality of how we add interactivity to our JavaScript is by using event listeners. So event listener, as the name suggests, is it listens for an event and then it has to do an action on that event. So this is the basic function, this is the basic syntax, for how you write an event listener. So element dot add event listener. So now element is a DOM object and we'd access it using DOM manipulation. So we learn more about it in the demo. But yeah, using dot add event listener, we could say click my function. So my function is a callback function in which you could define whatever you want your program to do. There are multiple event listeners, so you could talk about click, mouse over, mouse out, and resize. So mouse over and mouse out is when you mouse over an element and when you mouse out an element. And resize is something that's really cool. What it does is it fires an event listener when the browser is resized. Okay, let's explore some Chrome DevTools and understand how we can implement JavaScript, using Chrome DevTools and start debugging, so we understand more of everything we just did. Yeah, let's just open up this web page again. Oh yeah, look at this. The performance tab has loaded and it kind of tells you how much time and summarizes how much time it takes for the web page to load, and you can also see the main interactions, that is input, and this page also has some animation. So if you scroll down, you could see this animation out here. So it kind of accounts for all of that in the performance of this web page. So you could also run through it and see, cool, so there's an animation how it loads every frame, right? Alright, so anyway, getting back to JavaScript using Chrome DevTools. So let's just inspect this nav bar again, and if you look at this item, we can tell that it has an ID called home desk, right? So we head over to the console, and it's really important to get familiar with how the console works, because console is your developer's best friend. You can do so much with the console. So we'll just say hi. Yeah, cool. Okay, now let's just grab that element. So we can say document dot get element by ID and say home desk. Alright, so when we do that, it does select that specific ID, and this is how we access elements in the DOM using document.getElement by ID. And there's another thing called document.getElements by class name. So let's just look at this, and if you look at the code, you can see that each of these elements have a class called menu item. So we head in here and we say document.getElements by class name, and we say menu item. You can see that it returns an HTML collection. So it's important to notice this difference between document.getElement by ID and document.getElements by class name. So this one returns a list of all the elements, and this goes by the fact that an ID is unique to a specific element, while class names can be assigned to multiple elements. So if you want to access a specific element, we would probably say something like 2. Right, so then this gives you the specific element. So these are some ways in which you can access DOM elements. You could also do document dot query selector and say home desk. So now this selects the home desk. You can do document dot query selector all, right? And you can notice that this again returns a node list. This returns a list, which is quite different from document.getElement by ID. So that is how you can access the DOM. You can select any item. Once you know the class name or the ID, using these methods in DOM manipulation. Now let's just get this element, that's home desk, and store it to a variable. So now you can say var home desk equals document dot get element by id and call it home desk, right? And if you say home desk, that's the id should come up. Now I could do a lot with this particular element. I could say home desk dot style. So this are all the style declarations that I could use here. So if I say dot display equals none, then it would hide that element from the page. Similarly, if I say, let's just say inline, it's back again. I could do a lot of changes with just, instead of display, I could change the font size, the font color, the size, the, let's just say font weight. Make sure that when you're using JavaScript and you're changing styles, that you mention everything in camel case, like how I've done here. So I could say font weight 600, and you can see that it's already much bolder than all the other nav items. Alright, now let's add some functionality to it. So let's just say home desk dot add event listener, and on click, let's return a function that probably, okay, let's just say alert clicked, right? Cool. Now let's click on this element, and there you go. It returns an alert saying that it's been clicked. So this is how you can debug and try to add functionality. So if you're on your laptop, you can just open up a website and try replicating some of this, because the more you do and the more you figure some stuff out, you get the hang of it. So alright, let's just go back to the slides for now. Alright, so now that we've learned how DOM manipulation works and how to add event listeners, let's go ahead and add functionality to our project. So let's go ahead to our project screen, and right here I think again we did a lot in how the code works and DOM manipulation. So let's get some elements, and so let's just go back to index.html and add an ID. So what we could use this button for is like a toggle. So on the click of the button we could display some text, and another click of the button we could hide the text. So that's how a toggle works. So for now let's just add an ID, let's call it toggle. Alright, and we also need some content that we want to shift, so let's just call this, give this an ID of shake, and let's just give it some description. So this is the element that we will be toggling in, this is the element that we will be toggling. So another thing we'll have to do is add shake display none, because when the page initially loads, that should be empty, and on the click of the button we should add display block so that it's visible. On another click, again display none. So if you're kind of getting the hang of what I mean, we could go into, cool. We could go into the app.js and say var toggle and access the element document dot get element by id and say toggle. So this would get that element. So if we want to check something, always use console.log Similarly, let's get the other element. Var shake is equal to document dot get element by id shake. Now we have to add an event listener on the click of this button. So how we add that is toggle dot add event listener click, and we have a callback function. And for now, let's just see if it's working and say alert clicked. Right? Let's save this code and head back to the demo page. On the click of this button, it says click. So that's cool, it's working. And now we need a toggle display, just like how we did in Chrome DevTools. On click, we'll say on click, let's just say shake dot display shake dot style. So we access style, then display equal to block. Alright, but since it's a toggle functionality, we'll also have to add an if condition. So let's just say if shake.style display equal to block. Alright, in which case we would want it to be none, and else we could say display block. Another thing we could do is change the inner HTML. So something really cool in JavaScript is that you can not only add functionality to the page, but on any interaction you can change the CSS and the inner HTML, which is the HTML of the content of the button. So let's just say toggle.inner HTML, it should say more info, and in this case it should say less info. I think there's something, okay, yeah, cool, let's just say block here. Let's save this and head over to the demo page. Alright, so now here when we click on this, it shows up the description. On another click, the description is hidden. You can also see that the button changes from less information to more information. So that's super cool. In case this wasn't working or you weren't sure what's going on this page, for debugging JavaScript, the best way to use Chrome DevTools is to obviously use console.log, and if we did so, you could see that I console the button tab and it shows up. But if you want to go a step further from console.log, you can use the sources tab, and on the sources tab you could see event listener breakpoints. So these are all the event listeners that have been, you can see what's been added. So on mouse I can see click, and it'll show me all the event listeners that have been added on this page. You can also see DOM breakpoints and pause the script execution. So what happens is if you have multiple functions and it's really hard to debug line by line, so what you could do is you could pause the script here and make sure it goes to the next function call, and then you can see the exact line of code in which you have an error. And this is a very advanced way to handle errors using JavaScript. So that's debugging JavaScript in Chrome DevTools, and that's something you could look into if you'd like. Let's head over back to the slides. Cool. And hey, there we did it. If you console.log, we did it. We have completed a basic toggle functionality in our project. And yeah, so all that we did so far implementation wise in JavaScript was just a basic toggle functionality. You may feel that it's very basic, but toggle is something that I've used so many times in numerous projects. So toggle is very versatile and can be used not just for toggling text, but even for toggling between themes. So you could have a button that toggles between a light theme and a dark theme. And we've done something similar to that in our DSE-VIT webpage, where you can see I want dark mode, and then on click of the button, the entire webpage toggles, right? So that's again a simple toggle functionality, and there are numerous ways you can add in a toggle functionality. But all of this is just the P of so much JavaScript can do. JavaScript can do so much, from validating forms. So in this case, you could add a function that validates if the zip code is right. You could validate if the phone number is only digits, and if it's 10 digits long, using functions. You can also build games using JavaScript. So you can have different functions for the particle, its velocity, and the collisions. And there's a lot that you can handle using JavaScript. JavaScript is super vast, and feel free to explore and learn and start building something new with JavaScript. Okay, let's take a quick recap of what we did so far. We figured out a suitable editor for your code. I personally use VS Code. You could use whichever editor you like. We also discussed some of the really cool extensions on VS Code, the basic tags and the structure for HTML, CSS grid. I didn't go too much in depth for CSS grid. It's another huge topic, but if you're really interested, I'd recommend you go check out CSS grid on CSS tricks. And for JavaScript, we focus on DOM manipulation, and we just explored Chrome DevTools and how to explore and debug using Chrome DevTools. There's another thing that I'd like to mention in Chrome DevTools. It's just something that I'm sure a lot of y'all will like, and that is that Chrome DevTools does have a feature where you can set it to, say, dark mode. So all the people who like customizing their work, and you can customize it to a dark mode, which looks pretty much cooler. Cool. Let's just look at some questions right now. Cool. We have one new question. ASD asks, what is the difference between a window and document? So the window is the first thing that gets loaded onto the browser, and the document object is like your HTML, PHP, or any other document that is loaded onto the browser. So the document actually gets loaded inside the window object and has properties like title, URL, cookie. So I hope that clears the doubt. Let's head back to the slides. Yep. So if you have any further questions regarding anything we learned so far, feel free to put it out in the live chat. I'll give about a minute or two. Alright, let's proceed further. So the project that we just built, you can find it on github.com/smarter23/webinar. So it has a CSS, a JavaScript, and all that we just built. So if you want a closer look into all of that, you could do that as well. These are some really cool resources that I highly recommend you going through if you're really interested. This first link out here is a Google Doc to a lot of content. It has resources on HTML, CSS, JavaScript, as well as Chrome DevTools. So Chrome DevTools is really powerful, and it's much more than what I just did in the webinar today. These are some HTML resources, JavaScript resources, and CSS resources. These are just some of them that I really like enjoying reading, and some of them are really new that I came across while preparing for this webinar. All of the resources will be linked in the description below, so you can go check it out if you like. Thank you for attending this webinar, and I hope that if you're new to web development, this webinar motivated you and gave you a flavor of how much there is to web development. And if you were not a fresher, like if you knew what web development was and an expert at it, I hope this was a really cool refresher to how much there was to web development and the basics. So if you have any queries, and if you tried working on the project along with me, feel free to shoot out your doubts or the project pictures at us. Tweet us at DSCVIT, and you can also send us messages at dscvitvelour.com. At dscvitvelour. Okay, thank you for joining the stream. I'm Ananya Ganesh, signing off.